Is it true that he came up with the term graphic novel on the spot in order to not say the word comic book to the publisher?
That was his story. It sounds plausible. Yeah, the publisher um, was a friend of his, but it doesn't, as anybody in publishing knows, just because the publisher is your friend doesn't mean they're going to publish your work. So Will said to the guy, "I got something I think you're going to want to see," and I think his name was Oscar. I forget his last name. And the guy said, "What is it?" And yeah, Will knew if he said it's a comic book, the guy would say, who cares? I mean, get over it, Will. Comics are for kids, blah blah blah. So Will said it's a graphic novel, and of course, when he got there, the guy said it's a comic book. Okay, all right, that's the name of the. Uh, this is what I colloquially call Eisner 101, but the spirit of comics, the legacy of Will Eisner. That's my name. Okay,
Yeah,
next.
there we go.
This is actually last year's, it's the 2020 poster for Will Eisner Week. We do a new poster every year, usually always with a piece of art of Will's, the design by John Cook. So we have not unveiled the 2021 poster yet, but we're working on it. But this was the one. So it's celebrate Will Eisner. Will Eisner's birthday was March 6th. He was born in 1917. So this is why Will Eisner Week is the first week of March. Although we're pretty flexible. If somebody wants to do an event, you know, even until mid or late March, we've been known to have Will Eisner Week events in April. So if you have an idea for one, if you want to get involved, you can go to willeisner.com and you'll find out more about it. Next. And that is the Spirit. That is Will's best known creation. It's not the first Spirit, but it's from the first year of the Spirit. The Spirit came out
1940.
1940. Yeah. And as we were discussing before, Superman had, you'll see as we go through, but Superman was very popular. Superheroes and comic books in general were enjoying their biggest popularity, even though they've been around in various forms for years. And this, although eventually they were collected and put out as comic books, the Spirit was the headliner of a self-covered insert that appeared in syndicated and appeared in newspapers. So I think it was never in that many papers, but don't forget, everybody read the newspaper. So it was in like 22 papers, which meant it still reached 5 million people. So the way you would have now, if those of you who remember what a Sunday newspaper is or a newspaper is, they're packed with advertising circulars and the magazine, either whatever your local, either the New York Times or the LA Times or whatever your town is, and the Spirit was that format because the newspaper publishers and this one particular Register and Tribune syndicate wanted to get in on all the action that the kids were, all these kids were buying all these comics. Let's get in on some of that action, not just with our regular newspaper strips, but with the comic book insert. So you see it says on the upper left, comic book section, 3 complete stories. And the Spirit, I think it looks kind of like Victor Mature here, if anybody of you know that old time actor. Will was just going to do him as kind of like a pulp style detective, and the syndicate insisted that since superheroes are popular, he had to have a mask of some kind. So Will gave him that little mask and also a pair of gloves, and I guess that was as much a disguise as Clark Kent's glasses. So nobody supposedly ever figured out that Denny Colt, that the Spirit was Denny Colt. Okay, next. And this is the other, this was the second phase, or maybe the third phase of Eisner's career, was the graphic novels, starting with The Contract with God, which this is the version, I think, when DC Comics was putting out the Will Eisner Library. There was an earlier version with kind of a more monochromatic cover, but this was Will rolling the dice and taking a chance. And he wasn't the first one to use the term graphic novel. That's one of those comic book things where there's a dozen debates about who first used it, but he popularized the term. And he really put the medium on the map. Again, even though Contract with God at first wasn't a huge seller, it sparked everything from Mouse to Fun Home to any graphic novel you read that has any kind of personal or memoir or literary content. It goes back to Contract with God, which will I want to give it Will's greatest hit, so we can now go back in Will's. So next slide.
Is it true that he came up with the term graphic novel on the spot in order to not say the word comic book to the publisher?
That was his story. It sounds plausible. The publisher was a friend of his, but it doesn't, as anybody in publishing knows, just because the publisher is your friend doesn't mean they're going to publish your work. So Will said to the guy, I got something I think you're going to want to see. And I think his name was Oscar. I forget his last name. And the guy said, what is it? And yeah, Will knew if he said it's a comic book, the guy would say, who cares? I mean, get over it, Will. Comics are for kids, blah, blah, blah. So Will said, it's a graphic novel. And of course, when he got there, the guy said, it's a comic book. But I think it's, I'm guessing, especially when Will offered to subsidize it, Will was a serious guy and a good salesman, and that was his classic story that he had to come up with that on the spot. I think there's several other candidates for who first used the term, but I think we can safely say that Will popularized it.
How did it feel as a Jewish guy in New York seeing this comic?
It was definitely, that's a good question. It was surprising to me, I guess. We didn't have the internet, so I don't know how much press I've been reading about it. I knew Will was working on something that was like a serious comic book. I'm trying to think, was it surprising? It was, I didn't quite know what to make of it because I'd never seen anything like it, but it resonated with me, and it seemed familiar from the lives that my grandparents kind of lived in what could have been a tenement out of an Eisner. I had older parents, and hence I had older grandparents. So I was removed from it, but not removed from it. And the people and the situations seemed familiar. So it resonated, but it was odd because it wasn't, it was neither a Jack Kirby Stan Lee superhero comic, nor was it an over-the-top Robert Crumb underground comic. It was some other use of the medium that I think we all had to get used to. But that's so I think it resonated, and I was curious where it would go. If anywhere. I mean, I think it's funny, right? We look at this and we say, well, yes, this was the thing that started it all. That gave people license to talk about their families and sexuality and ethnicities and everything. But what if this had been a total dud? What if 5 people bought it? I mean, I guess it was in the air. Probably somebody else would have eventually, maybe a Spiegelman or Pfeiffer himself, or who experimented with the form himself. But that's sort of an interesting what if, right? What if Will had just printed those 1,500 copies and said, well, that I got that out of my system. Now I'm going back to doing my instructional manuals for the Army. I mean, that's that's I think given what I know of Will, it's probably unlikely. I think he would have gone to some other creative way to say. I think he was what we didn't know, and well, I can see we're on the 3rd slide. We're already like third of 140 slides, but
The first few went quickly.
Yes. You know, what we didn't know was that this was not just Will attempting to do a comic book version of Bellow or Roth or Malamud, you know, the three key Jewish American novelists of the era. But it was a very personal story that he was telling in metaphorical terms, but it was I guess that's what, you know, what fiction does. It was not a straight on. Later on he would do straight on memoir comics and things that were more directly about his life, but in this one he had, you know, a Contract with God, which again we can go into more deeply, was about a great loss he and his wife had suffered, and this was his way of dealing with it. Again, I mean, it's pretty brave for a guy who knew how to write. I mean, clearly he was, you know, he was a writer as much as he, you know, he used to joke about his joke was that he wasn't a very good writer or a very good artist, so he put them together and became a passable cartoonist. Well, that's very false modesty. You know, you think here's a 60-year-old guy. He's, you know, he can carve himself. He's very disciplined with time and very focused. But he did sit down to write a novel, which he could have, right? I mean, a lot of people write novels. Maybe he would have needed somebody to edit it for him and structure it, but he didn't. He said, "I'm doing this as," and it's really a series of novellas. It's four stories that are thematically linked by taking place in and around the same building in the Bronx. But it's interesting that he had the faith in the medium to now take these skills he'd honed over the years and want to do serious literature with them. All right, let's go to the next. Let's get some background on Will. That is young Will Eisner. Those of you who may have seen him in the last 40 years of his life might not know that he ever had hair, but he had hair. This was for a series of photos that were done, I think, when the Spirit was about to start it was popular enough that they decided to do a daily newspaper strip of the Spirit. And I think one of the big papers it was in was one of the Philadelphia dailies. Maybe the Philadelphia Daily Eagle. I'm not sure. One of the big Philly papers. And so there's a series of photos of Will. You can tell he's got the same clothes on. It's in the same. I mean, honestly, I think it's his parents' apartment. I think the most successful cartoonist in comics had not yet moved out of his parents' house. So this. So he was, I think, with his folks, and this was the article, I'm pretty sure, around this period when he was first quoted as saying, you know, at a time when comics were already being attacked. Comics were attacked from the days of comic strips, but certainly the year before, this is around 41, in 1940, an influential critic named Sterling North had really put out this very widely syndicated article about how horrible comics were for children, for adults, for animals, for everybody. And here was Will Eisner within a year saying comics have the potential to be a great art form. I mean, it's really pretty, you know, sure, he wanted to sell newspapers and sell the Spirit, but I mean, that nobody else, there was nobody else in 1941 saying that comics could be an art form. So anyway, next slide.
Wait, I have a question. You said the Spirit
Feel free to interrupt.
was a daily strip, but I only know it as a Sunday strip. Are you saying there were black and white 4-panel strips?
Yes, starting a year in the Spirit debuted as the Spirit section that we saw before in 40, but in 41, yes, it was a daily strip. It lasted, I want to say 2 years.
Was it not seen as successful?
You know, it came out just as Will was drafted.
Oh, there we go.
So he did some great stuff. I mean, it's actually somebody who they just I think that was part of even of the DC reprint. There's one volume, but there are various volumes of those. There's one famous one of, we see maybe it's an invisible person or something. Somehow it's these tracks appear, these footprints appearing in the snow. And then, I think I don't
Oh,
think
this
it's
is it.
invisible. You see the footprints, and then the last panel, you see the spirit collapsed, face first in the snow. He's been injured or shot or something.
Oh, this is it. He's working on a 4-panel strip.
Oh yeah, yep. There you go. So I think Will started it, and then, like the rest of. I mean, one thing about Will's studio is everybody worked there at some point, and the people that he left who mostly did the strip. I forget who wrote it, but the art, maybe they wrote it too, was by Jack Cole and Lou Fine, I think. So you couldn't have put it in the hands of better artists. But yeah, I don't think it caught on as a daily, especially without Will there to supervise on a daily basis. A daily newspaper strip was what every comic book artist of that generation wanted. That because syndicated cartoonists were literally, well, they figuratively, literally. Well, you figure it out. But they were figuratively and literally. Yes, they weren't literally rock stars. But they were the rock stars of their time. If these were celebrity Al Cap and Chester Gould and Walt Kelly and Ham Fisher. All those people were written about in the gossip columns. I mean, these were celebrities, and they, even if they didn't, everybody had a different deal with the syndicate, but they, well, Charles Schultz, of course, is the ultimate, I guess, realization of that with the Peanuts empire. But that was what all the comic book artists wanted to be. Comics were really got no respect at all, and the home run for what all those guys wanted, and they were kept from it by various reasons. Some of them having to do with anti-Semitism, some having to do with just snobbishness against comic artists and sheer skill and the clubbishness of the comic strip industry. But so when Will first loved the opportunity. He was doing very well doing comic books, but he jumped at the opportunity to do the Spirit in a newspaper format, and then again also was very happy to have the chance to do it as a syndicated strip. He had lasted about 2 years though.
Okay.
So there's Eisner. I guess it's not that much later. It's probably
Probably a year later.
Within a year or two later, but lit much more dramatically. And that's him in his studio in Tudor City, I believe. He had a studio. If you've been to New York, or if you know the area around the United Nations, before the United Nations was built, that was a strange area. It was kind of a mix of luxury housing and like literal slaughterhouses. I mean, so it was when like the docks of Manhattan, the docks of Manhattan and the edges of Manhattan, which are now, multi-gazillion dollar co-ops and condominiums. Even when I grew up down the block, I grew up in Manhattan. Down the block from where I grew up was a brewery. They were like, I would go to school, and this was the Upper East Side of Manhattan, which was not as uniformly fancy as movies would have you believe, but it was literally beer being brewed in like a 2-block square factory on my corner in what's today considered a very upscale part of New York. So anyway, that was Eisner. So it's called Tudor City, and there was a number of cartoonists had apartments and/or studios there. Next. I just want to give you a little bit of background. That's not for when Will was born. He was born in 1917. Woodrow Wilson was president.
Mm-hmm.
There was a pandemic going on then too. I think Wilson caught it. Anyway, so that was the president then. Next.
It's almost exactly 100 years ago. That's
yeah. Well, we had Will's centennial 3 years ago. Yeah, that's so in the papers before the Spirit and before Peanuts, they had news: U.S. at war. Next. there was stuff going on in Russia with the Russian Revolution. Will was born in interesting times. So next.
So we're kids today.
Yes, I know. God, lucky them. So these were the movies that were popular. Theater Barra was starring Cleopatra. Chaplin was that. There was like a new
Chaplin.
Chaplin movie every week, including one called The Immigrant, ironically enough.
Hmm.
Easy Street. These things are just timeless, aren't they? And Theda Barra was called the It Girl. And she was one of the big, and that's interesting. It looked like she was the producer of this movie too, a Theda Barra super production.
This is stuff that really interests me. Like I was saying earlier with Jules Pfeiffer's book, it's just some people are so big at some point in their lives, and I've never heard of her.
Really? Okay, I'll look her up. She's very
So,
interesting.
but I mean,
character.
but in comparison, I have definitely heard of Chaplin
Well,
and have
that's
watched Chaplin. So
right. Okay. Well, it's funny
yeah.
It's funny what names and what images survive. Let's go to the next one. If you found that interesting, this might blow your mind. This was Over There, was by George M. Cohan, who most people know if they know him at all from Yankee Doodle Dandy, the Jimmy Cagney movie. Okay, I'm talking to the wrong generation. Do you know who Cagney was?
I've heard of Cagney, but I haven't seen.
Okay, Yankee Doodle Dandy. You should watch that tonight. That's an so anyway, this guy George M. Cohan wrote and performed in major Broadway hits of the era. He was a god. There's a statue of him in Times Square, actually. But the thing that's interesting about this, the image on the lower right is from a play that was popular, not a Cohan play, but it was a hit show on Broadway, and it was called, that's right, Hamilton. And it was about the life of Alexander Hamilton.
100 years later.
100 years later, so that was the year, again, 1917, when Eisner was born. Next.
Stuff cycles around.
And these are people who were born the same year as Will. So do you know who any of these people are?
I wouldn't know. No.
Okay. Robert Mitchum.
Okay.
Dean Martin.
I know Dean Martin.
Okay.
My mom is a big fan of Dean Martin's.
Okay. John Lee Hooker.
No, I don't.
One of the major blues guys of all time.
Mm.
Okay. Next, okay. If you didn't know them, you might know the one on the left. You might know the woman.
She looks familiar.
She's June Foray, the voice of Rocky.
Oh, it's June Foray.
Did she just die? I know
she just died like a couple years ago, I think.
Okay, but I think she got past 100. Arthur C. Clarke of 2001.
Okay, I've definitely never seen his picture, but I know who he is.
And then on the bottom is Thelonious Monk and Dizzy Gillespie, the jazz musician.
Oh, that's what they look like.
So those are people born the same year as Will Eisner. And
so I actually know all the people here. I'm just not familiar with it because they're more known for their sound.
Yeah. These are, and then next, you might know this guy. Yeah.
Oh man, did that guy beat up Nazis?
He beat up Nazis, and he drew people beating up Nazis. That's Jack Kirby, of course, who we talked about before, and I'm sure we'll be talking about more. That might be the ultimate Jack Kirby picture, with a cigar on a New York street. So that's it. And then the next one.
Wouldn't even know he was a cartoonist.
I
have no idea.
You think he's a gangster.
You think he was a gangster.
I think he likes people to think that. Next. And this guy was born the same year as Will Eisner. This is, in case you didn't know, it's John F. Kennedy.
Wait, Kirby and Eisner were born in the same year?
Yep.
Oh, I thought Kirby was a little younger for some reason.
I think people usually think that Eisner is younger, but no, that's a funny thing about time and history, and that's sort of one reason. I mean, I'm a kind of a history trivia buff anyway, but one reason I like to show sort of who was born then, just to sort of give you an idea of who's contemporary. I mean, people who well, we can get to it later. But Eisner. I think Eisner was born in March and Kirby was born in August, so that makes them like 6 months different in age.
I think I only really think that because Kirby worked for Eisner.
He did. Well, Eisner was very precocious in terms of running his own business. Everybody worked for Eisner. Everybody for Eisner. Everybody worked for Stan at some point. It was hard to be a cartoonist in the 40s and not work for one of those guys, because they went through they produced a lot of material and needed a lot of people. And so they were, and his little digression, shocking. Stan was always known to have a lot of work to give to people, and I guess Eisner too. And you could learn a lot from, certain. I mean, if you were an artist, I don't know how much you'd learn. You could learn theoretically from Stan, and Stan give you pointers, but was not himself an artist. Eisner would sit down and just take a piece of, tracing paper and go over your work.
Wonder what that would be like. Okay. And which one I would prefer.
What to have?
Yeah, to be. Stan. Yeah, which one I would prefer to be my boss. That's interesting.
I didn't include it as part of this because we only have like 8 hours. But there is a Stan did a series. I have stills from it. You'll see later. Stan did a series of videos in the 90s called The Comic Book Greats, in which Stan plays host and interviews all these artists. But of course, he's Stan, so he's not going to shut up, and which is good. But I mean, the one with him and Eisner is it's interesting. A lot of them are on YouTube. That one is not. I'm not sure why, but the one with him and Eisner is very revealing about both of them. It's a terrific show. It's about 90 minutes. All right, what's next? Let's. Now that we got.
E.C. Seeger.
So these were the influences on Will and people he cited. This is Seeger's Popeye, and this is the famous, excuse me, the famous one. A comic artist ain't no different than you or me or anybody, except he knows how to draw pictures and is crazy in the head. So Popeye, which is still a character people know today.
Yeah, but again, it's one of those things where he's much less popular today than he used to be.
Right, it's a name. Popeye or Seeger or both?
Popeye, because I think even when I was a kid, people didn't really know Seeger anymore. But people still knew Popeye, Bluto, Olive Oil, and everything.
Yeah, and I mean,
I feel like the kids today may not so much. They're more familiar with Popeye's, the restaurant.
Oh, right. Which uses the logo from the comic and cartoons. I wonder if there are any connections.
Which doesn't have spinach, which is weird.
Some of the things
yeah.
That is interesting, but they have a lot of fried stuff. Next, this is Harriman's Crazy Cat, another classic strip from the early part of the 20th century that, that was just, I mean, you couldn't ask for a more simple, direct approach to cartooning. So next, which probably go through the slides a little faster. This is something that was very influential and is seen as a kind of a proto graphic novel. Do you recognize this at all? Have you seen this?
Is this Max Ernst? No.
No, it's Lind Ward.
Okay.
Lind Ward did woodcut, mostly silent narrative picture novels. They were, every page was a single image. This one is from a book called God's Man, God''S Man. And it's Will always cites it as a visual influence and certainly as a proto-graphic novel. His stuff has been reprinted in the past few years. You can find it, Lindward, Lind Ward.
Okay.
Big influence. Somebody Eisner would talk about would cite a lot. Next, please. This is more of Ward. I think it's also from God's Man. I'm not sure, but this is, if you know your Eisner, if you know your Kirby, you can just, or your film noir, you can just see what an influence this guy was.
Yeah.
And woodcuts are hard. That's okay. This is, in the In the general world, we have Harvard, Princeton, Yale, schools like that. In the comic book world, many of those creators of the first generation or two did not go to college, but they went to legendary high schools. This is a high school called DeWitt Clinton in the Bronx. It still exists, although it's at that time it was an all-boys school. It had 12,000 students. You can imagine going to high school with 12,000 other kids. And largely because of its position in the Bronx, which was a center of immigrants, especially what I call the classic Godfather trilogy of Jews, Italians, and Irish, with a bunch of Black people and Hispanic people mixed in. DeWitt Clinton has this astonishing alumni list, which you can look up online if you want. They have, but I'll show you some of the relevant, because then DeWitt Clinton figures very importantly in Will Eisner's story and in other people's. I'll show you. Next slide, please. So Will was active, as you would imagine, as the artist, one of the main artists in the school. These were illustrations that he did, I think, for the yearbook. So that's pretty good for 17 or 16. Next. This is a sports cartoon he did for the Clintonian.
And it's a woodcut.
Woodcut by W. Eisner. Clinton was his school. Commerce was their big football rival, the High School of Commerce. Next. And these are some other people who went to DeWitt Clinton High School. On the left is a guy named Bob Kahn, who later became known as Bob Kane. On the right, and he was, I think he was in school with Will. He was a little old, a couple of years older. If you know your comics history, you know Bob Kane's exact age is a subject of controversy.
It's not the only thing that's a subject of controversy.
And speaking of Bob Kane controversy, that's Bill Finger. And together they created Batman. But they were among the alumni at DeWitt Clinton, as were let's see the next one. This is their creation.
Of course they go back to high school. That makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think a Finger was a little older, so he may have just been somebody who Bob knew from the neighborhood. They were from it's actually a place called Poe Park.
Yeah.
Up in the North Bronx, where legend has it the two of them sat and plotted out the Batman origin of the Batman stories. And just a couple of years ago, thanks to the efforts of people, including a guy named Mark Tyler Nobleman. Finger has been finally recognized as the co-creator of Batman, and they named one street that on the border of Poe Park, Bill Finger Place, Bill Finger Way, something like that. I was there for the ceremony a couple of years ago.
I contributed to that book. Very, very slightly. Because I wrote an article about Finger maybe 10 years ago, and he saw it.
Oh, cool.
And he asked me if I could find him a specific issue where something happened. I forgot what it was. And I actually wasn't the one who found it. A friend of mine found it. Okay. Well, so I guess he contributed to that book.
There you go. So yeah, and you stole credit from your friend, just like Bob Kane did from Bill Finger. Sure. Sure. Carry on that great comic tradition. So a lot of people, Erwin Hazen went there, Patty Chayefsky, if you know your playwrights, Daniel Shore, who was a major reporter and on Nixon's enemies list. He was on NPR for years and CBS. People, and James Baldwin was there. And this next person also went there. Next, please. Stanley Martin Lieber was a student at Clinton High School. That's Stan a few years later, when he was already working at Timely Comics and had changed his name to Stan Lee. That's a blow up from an incredibly detailed photo of, I think it's from I think Martin Goodman took the entire, not just the comics, but the entire staff of his magazines out to go see Bambi. which I guess was a big deal that year. And this was from a lunch he took them all out to. That's Stan. And next, please. And
Oh, hey.
I might have mentioned I wrote that's Stan as most people know him as he looked in the cameos, and that is the cover of my recent biography of Stan: A Marvelous Life, the amazing story of Stan Lee, from St. Martin's Press, Macmillan. The paperback just came out about a month ago,
Yeah.
and if you're
An
able
audiobook.
to, and yes, exactly. If you like listening to this, then imagine 14 hours of me talking in the audiobook. But actually, I have to say, people, I have gotten compliments on it, and there were professionals directing and editing me on it. So, but anyway, that exists. Feel free to buy a copy. It's at your independent bookstore, your local independent bookstore, Amazon, the digital version. Anyway, but Stan went to high school, the same high school DeWitt Clinton as those guys. And we can just, in case you don't know who Stan Lee is, this is, of course, the first Fantastic Four. Not the first, the fourth issue of Fantastic Four, The Return of the Submariner.
I think it's the first one with their costumes.
Second one with their costumes.
Okay.
But it's the first one. I guess the Human Torch, in a way, was, a revamped 30s and 40s timely Atlas character. But the Submariner coming back really kind of led the way to the merging of the Marvel universe of the 60s and beyond with the comics that had come out in the 30s and 40s. All right. I just okay, now, no, please, let's, as you know, I have a lot of, so anyway, the story comes together. Will is, even while he's in school, he's trying to find work. And he runs into Kane on a New York street. And Kane says, I've been doing some work for this new magazine called, wow, what a magazine. And they're looking for people. So he sent Eisner over there. And so that's a cover that Will did. And that saga, we can go. So Will, that was Will's real first professional work. I think he'd done some advertising work, some illustrations for small ads in newspapers. This was his first real comics work. Next, please. There's another cover that I think is a painting that Will did. Comic story, stamps, planes. Yes, that was Captain Scott Dalton. That was a character. Popeye, W.C. Everybody was in this. Popeye, W.C. Fields. This was Will. This was about 1936. Next. And the magazine lasted 4 issues. It had Will's contributions, which again have recently been collected. Was a strip with the unfortunate name of Harry Carey. But what Will did throughout his career was to pretend that the company he was working for had many artists. He would sign his name. Will Eisner is not it's a fine name, and he signed that plenty, and you'll see his signature, or maybe you have. But he was Willis B. Renzi. I don't know where Carl Heck came from. But he would draw and try to draw in different styles and for different genres. You can see Harry Carey is some kind of private eye thing. Uncle Otto seems to be about some kind of eccentric old guy.
Yeah.
So Will would, this is really learning in the trenches. Will just learning all these different ways to draw in comics. Next, please. The Law of Caribou County. This is by William E. Eisner. He did. I'm not sure if this appeared specifically in WoW or in other things he did with this next guy. Let's get the next panel. This is Mus'em. I'm sorry. This is another thing. Because he partnered up when he went to the offices of WoW, What a Magazine. They were having, which was literally in the back of a garment center clothing factory.
Mm-hmm.
It was I think maybe this was, and Jerry Iger was the guy running it, and maybe it was an uncle of his or something gave him some space for this cockamamie comic book business, whatever that was, to put out this magazine. So Will helped him out of a jam at the printers. They were having trouble. They were at the printers for the issue. And Will had done some apprenticing in a printing shop, and so he knew how to fix it. And so he and Iger became partners and would put out stuff like Muss 'Em Up, either for their own comics or they would package stuff for other publishers as well. Next. And this is Jerry Iger. So that was, and their company became known as Eisner and Iger, which oddly enough, although
Oddly
Will
enough,
Eisner, as far as we know, is not related to the guy from Disney,
Michael Eisner.
Michael Eisner. I believe Jerry Iger was Robert Iger's eccentric uncle or great uncle. So, because Iger is, Robert Iger has spoken about that. So they were partners. They had a shop called Eisner and Iger. They were very successful. They were both cartoonists. Jerry was more of the outside guy and the salesman. Will. Next, please. I can show you sort of.
Seems like that's a combination that works its way across comics.
Well, through life, one might say.
And I just want to say, loving the mustache.
This is Will years later did a graphic novel or graphic novella called The Dreamer, which was one of his, thinly veiled memoir pieces. And here he calls it Iron and Samson, as both Eisner and Iger. Will says he always said he got his name first in the partnership because he had like $15 to chip in to start the business, and Jerry either had nothing or only had 10 or 5. So, but this is, it was the Depression. It was the height of the Depression of the 1930s. And so anybody who could draw, you put an ad in the paper and suddenly you got people with portfolios lined up. And Will really had this assembly line system that was not out of place in a former garment factory of people sitting at boards. And I mean, it says right there, we'll set up like this. I'll sit in the center and lay out stories, pass the lettered pages to the pencil and ink people along the left wall. They'll pass the ink pages up the other side of the shop for backgrounds and cleanup. And that's, that was sort of how that was how comics were made, and to a large degree. Even guys like Siegel and Schuster, who had their own shops, I think set them up, probably not for this kind of industrial output, but Superman was a big business, and Siegel and Schuster for a time were the main ones supplying it. That's another comic story. Anyway, this was Will later in the 80s, I think, recalling what his life had been. I don't know if the height differential between him and Jerry Iger was the same as he's drawn with him. And Will was not afraid. I mean, Will was good looking, and he was not afraid to draw himself as a good looking young man. When he drew himself as an older person, he would lampoon himself more and make himself look more like Dolan from The Spirit. Anyway,
loving this page. I always loved the way he did windows and making them look like panels.
Well, that was really one of his innovations in the graphic novels, even more so than The Spirit. This was another. This was a character they packaged. In other words, there were publishers that didn't want to hire whole staff, so they would hire people, what we call packagers, who would literally bring them a package of a completed comic book package. This is one of the characters that Will created. I forget if it was a co-creation with somebody, but it was Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, who exists to this day. And you may notice it is signed by W. Morgan Thomas. That was Will Eisner. That was, of course, yet another Will Eisner pseudonym. So they were very productive and very successful. Next, please.
The jungle genre used to be big, kids. Like,
it was huge, and it's a whole. And then here's something else they did, Espionage starring Black Ace. This signed. Now I know I had a couple in here. I forget. I don't think this is one by Kirby because we'd mentioned that Kirby worked for him. So let's go to the next one. Hawks of the Sea by again by Willis Renzi. So these were printed much bigger than a comic today. So you could fit all these panels on a comic, but you can see the beginnings of the spirit here. You can see Eisner experimenting with angles and shadows and being very influenced by the black and white films of the day. Next, please.
Loving this one. That one.
Oh yeah.
Oh, here we go.
This is, and then we talked about, you know, how all these different people worked for Eisner. This again is Eisner's thinly veiled fictionalization. He calls the Jack Kirby characters Jack King. And this is a story. And again, I don't think Jack was, I've seen Jack Kirby. He was not that short, but, but you know, Eisner dealt in caricature. So this is a story about a mob guy trying to muscle in and insist that they use their towel services. Yes, in the days before paper towels, I guess that was a big business, getting towels for restrooms and offices and so on. So Kirby, you know, it looks like Eisner is not putting up much of a fight. So again, you can't say Will is over romanticizing himself here, but then Kirby comes in and chases this big tough gangster. Don't pull any of that mob stuff around here. Beat it, bum.
It works. The height difference works to make Kirby look tougher.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. He's kind of like Puck or Wolverine, you know.
Yeah.
And Al Jaffe worked for Eisner, just tons and tons of people, and he worked for Stan. He did something called Inferior Man, which was a spoof of Superman, obviously, for Eisner. Next, that's just a close up of the image. This is work that you can. I mean, you know, if I didn't tell you, you'd still know that's, you know, that's early Jack Kirby. You know, that is Kirby. I think maybe before. I'm not sure where Kirby's career in animation came in, but this is all kind of Jack Kirby, who signs this as
Kurt Davis.
Court Davis.
Court Davis.
Court Davis. So that's Kirby. Just wanted to show, you know, I mean, you can see the way the women are drawn, the way the panels are framed. You can see the beginnings of somebody who was on his way to becoming, you know, Jack Kirby. Next.
Looks like Jack channeling Alex Raymond.
You know, I think all those guys go back to Raymond and again a couple of other people like that. You're right. Next. More Kirby. This is Wilton of the West, who this isn't even signed by anybody. Yeah, it's pretty clearly Kirby. Although, you know, I mean, I say it's Kirby, but I think Eisner, like Harvey Kurtzman, wouldn't surprise me if at least there were thumbnails done by Will or inked by Will. You know, Will generally like to have some participation in anything he was putting in. I think at a certain point there was so much, he was putting out so much by volume he couldn't, but you know, but certainly again, even more so, you can see echoes of what would become Kirby's hallmark styles in the 40s and then another iteration later in the 60s.
These are definitely golden age Kirby faces.
Yep. These guys are Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. We were talking about high schools, and wait, I have little reproductions of all these, so I can kind of map. All right, we don't have their high school, but these were high school buddies from Cleveland, from a neighborhood called Glenville, which was again a Jewish immigrant neighborhood in Cleveland. And they lived, once again, Mark Tyler Nobleman has literally counted the number of paces from Jerry Siegel's house to Joe Shuster's house. He could tell you literally how many feet apart they were. And if you should find yourself in Cleveland, Cleveland is very mixed feelings about honoring its comic book greats. But you can find Jerry Siegel's house, thanks to Brad Meltzer and several other people, It's been kind of preserved as signage, and I guess it's maybe landmarked, but it's not a museum. Just regular people live there. Like when I was in Cleveland a few years ago, I asked a guy named Mike Sangiacomo, who is a journalist who covers his beats before he retired. I think he's retired. If you have work for him, don't not call him. I don't know. Um, but Mike knew that, I said, I'm going to Cleveland, and I want to go see the Jerry Siegel house. And how would I get in? He said, "Well, ring the bell and tell them I sent you. If they're not busy, they'll let." I went, "Okay." But there was nobody home when I got. It was just surreal. It was in the middle of a huge blizzard. There was like 10 feet of snow. But anyway, these guys invented Superman, and he was the Superman's first appearance in Action Comics in 1938. And with that, they jump started the comic book. Superman was the killer app for comics. Suddenly, comics were much more popular. Every kid wanted to have them. Lots of grown-ups, eventually lots of soldiers when they were off fighting World War II. This may look like nothing now, but to have this kind of hybrid science fiction, soap opera, dual identity um, story and character was a big thing. And so suddenly everybody wanted to get in on comic books. Next, please. Anyway, and Superman, was so popular. He was the first character to actually have his own comic. In Action Comics, he was one of many features. So popular, a year later, suddenly he's got his own comic. And next, please. And Will Eisner sort of got caught up in the story. Batman, although he's not as super powered, obviously was inspired literally by Bob Kane showing up in the office and the editor telling him, "Superman's popular, what do you got?" And coming in, he and Finger coming up with Batman. A guy named Victor Fox was a publisher who had worked, I think, as an accountant for DC Comics and started his own line. And he hired Eisner to come up with a character that was an imitation of Superman. Again, we have this whole phenomenon now with hundreds of superheroes, and rarely does anybody sue over imitating them. There were just so many, I think they just wouldn't stand up in court. But this was early in that game, and DC Comics sued Victor Fox for this Will Eisner created character, Wonder Man. And this is not one of the bright moments in Will's career, because Will had said for years that he refused to lie and say, Will had been directed by Fox to imitate Superman.
Mm-hmm.
And Will had always said that he refused to do it in court, and he told that, he refused to lie and say it was his idea and that Fox was innocent. And he always claimed that cost him a lot of money because Fox withheld payment he owed him. The transcripts were found a few years ago,
I
and
saw those.
and it turns out that Will did what most of us would have done, but he did lie on Fox's behalf, although Fox probably screwed him out of the money anyway. But this was sort of an interest. This might be why Will never really liked superheroes after that.
Do you think he believed it though? Eventually, like he told the story so many times that by the end he believed
look,
it.
he did put it in a graphic novel, and it's not. He must have. I think that's a interesting human phenomenon that psychologists could tell us more about. But I guess if something is such a painful memory that you don't want to believe it the way it happened, because I don't see how he could have put it in that memoir novel without believing that that's how it happened. It's very weird, and it just makes him more human. But it's a pretty good looking superhero though too. Actually,
It's decent. Yeah.
Has anybody ever tried to? I mean, Marvel years later had a character called Wonder Man. I guess nobody bothered to copyright or trademark it. But
I don't think I've seen this Wonder Man. No, revived.
I guess because Marvel owns that name.
Maybe, but I see the Golden Age Daredevil a lot. So
did you read that book? That new book about Lev Gleason?
I haven't read that one. No.
Well, American Daredevil, you got to read it. I just read it.
Mm-hmm.
It really, it's an amazing book about Gleason and that whole subsection of comics history that nobody knows about. I reckon, yeah.
More
Called
forgotten
American
again. Yeah.
Huh?
For the one of those forgotten areas of comic book history again.
And Gleason was, I mean, Gleason and Charlie Biro, they were huge. Holy cow, those comics, outside of Marvel, Timely and National, Marvel and DC, Biro that was a big, read the book. It's really, or
Yeah.
look up Len Gleason and Charlie Biro. Anyway, next. These are, we saw one of these guys before on the right. That's Jack Kirby with Joe Simon. And they, of course, created Captain America, who was punching Nazis a year before America went to war. And it really, this was a controversial thing for American pop culture to take on Hitler. There was a big isolationist movement in America. There was a lot of hostility towards immigrants, and Simon and Kirby, as Jewish comic creators, children of immigrants, were taking a risk in advocating, for America to go into the war and save the world from fascism. But this, and the idea that you would have Hitler as a villain. This was around the time of Chaplin's The Great Dictator, so it was starting to be in the air, but this was still fully. This is cover dated March 1940, so it probably came out in December. I'm sorry, it's cover dated March 41, so it probably came out December 1940, a full year before Pearl Harbor. So I mean, America, there was a draft. I mean, it was pretty clear that America was going to have no choice but to get into the war, but not, there were a lot of people that was not popular with, and this was pretty well. Superman was not punching Nazis.
Well, he was beating up corporate lobbyists and politicians, though.
Well, no, he was fighting the good fight, but
Yeah.
well, oddly enough, even Captain America, if you read the first couple of years of Captain America, I know this is a real digression, he actually never went to Europe to fight Nazis. He was fighting saboteurs in America.
Yeah.
And more often than not, he was fighting like Frankenstein monsters and crazy horror stories. It was a really interesting, but the covers always had them doing that, so that, and doing their part. So that was controversial and timely, and Simon and Kirby got death threats. You can see that Jack Kirby was not a guy, because Simon and Kirby were on staff then. They were the editor and art director, and their assistant was a kid named Stan Lieber.
Yeah.
But that's another talk. But anyway, but you could see that Kirby did not take well to threats from wannabe tough guys. Let us see what's next. And so in the middle of this, with Superman being popular, Batman being popular, Captain America, as well as suddenly it's the era of the superhero. This is the dawn of that age. And so the syndicate wanted a superhero, and they made Eisner, I think, was looking to explore new horizons like he always was. And he saw this because Eisner and Iger was doing fine packaging all sorts of comics for all sorts of companies. And Eisner let himself be bought out by Jerry Iger. And he went into this business of creating this 16-page comic insert. It was The Spirit with several other backups that he supervised. And this was a big risk, but with the potential of a big payoff.